Hello everybody, welcome, and thank you so much for being with me here today. My name's Georgie and I'm going to be telling the story today of how I got diagnosed with Ehlers Danlos syndrome and my experience with the condition. If you haven't heard of Ehlers Danlos syndrome, it's a group of genetic, heritable, connective tissue disorders that predominantly affect the collagen throughout the body. I'm diagnosed with the hypermobile type and I was diagnosed at 21 years old. EDS manifests with a wide array of symptoms. The hallmark symptoms are loose, unstable joints and fragile, stretchy skin. However, the condition encompasses much more than that. And because of this, it affects people in a multitude of ways. So today I'm going to be telling the story of how that's affected me throughout my life, but do bear in mind it may be very different for other people with the condition. So for the purpose of the video, I'm going to split this up into sections, starting with early childhood and then moving through life stages into later adulthood, and explaining just a brief description of how the conditions affected me during those times. So starting with early childhood. Looking back now, I can see that I actually had a lot of symptoms even in early childhood, but obviously I didn't understand what was causing them back then. So the first of these was allergies and sensitivities and intolerances, especially to foods. And the first of these that manifested was a milk allergy, even when I was a small baby. So I remember that it would make me feel very unwell to have milk. When my mother was feeding me, it was an extremely difficult task. I would just cry when she'd come into the room with my bottle for feeding. And I think I just knew even back then that it was going to make me feel unwell, and I clearly had an intolerance to it, even as a small baby. And throughout childhood, and as I started to get a bit older, I developed a lot of allergies and sensitivities to food, but that's something I'm going to talk about a lot more later in the video. So another symptom that I struggled with when I was in school was chronic pain, and this first started in my knees and in my hips, but I also struggled with my hands, so I remember finding it very difficult to write, for example. And I know looking back now that that's caused by hypermobility in my fingers, which makes it very difficult to grip a pen. But I remember finding it very hard to write, especially if it was for long periods of time. And when I was in primary school, my writing was very bad. So the teachers, they tried to help me make it a bit better. And as I got older, it did get a little bit better, but even now, I wouldn't say it's particularly good. And with my hand problems, I did go to a doctor when I was quite young because I was having some trouble with the tendons in my hands. And I was actually diagnosed with trigger finger. That was later changed, and I now know that it was just caused by hypermobility of the tendons because my tendons are very loose in my hand. But I'll attempt to show you on camera. So as you can see, they just move about very freely, and it can cause a lot of pain if they're moving about and a lot of difficulty using my hands. And in terms of the rest of my body, I had also started to experience pain, for example, in my back and in some of my other joints. So this is the first time that I was referred to a physiotherapist to help deal with that. And something I also remember as a child was just feeling constantly exhausted. It was like a cloud of fatigue would just be looming over me all the time that I couldn't shake. And I couldn't really understand why. I would always look to my friends and think, is this how they feel also? But when you only live in your body, you don't really have anything to compare it to, so I just thought that was normal. And I would also frequently get sick. So I remember as a child, I would frequently have colds, flus, strep throat, just everything under the sun. I was just frequently sick, and also like stomach infections or bugs. I would just always be the first one to get sick and have time off of school because of it. When I was younger, I was a competitive gymnast. I did that for 11 years, and you'll find that actually a lot of people with EDS do go into gymnastics or dancing or these types of sports, because if you're very bendy, that's actually quite beneficial. It's quite normalised in the gymnastics community to have things like injuries or bruising, because it's quite a high impact sport. But I can definitely look back now and understand that for me, those things were particularly severe, and I would get them very frequently and very badly. And even now, I don't really do any exercise, but I still find I'm constantly bruised and constantly injured, so it's definitely caused by EDS. So I touched a little bit on the bruising. In terms of other physical or visible symptoms that I do have extremely pale translucent skin, to the point where doctors even questioned my mum if that was normal for me or whether I was under the weather because of it. And I also have very visible veins and spider veins, for example, behind the backs of my eyes. And I also got stretch marks at a very young age. I didn't get them in particularly unusual places because with EDS you can sometimes get them there, like for example on the arms. For me, it was particularly the hips and the stomach, but I definitely got them at a very young age and also when I hadn't really changed weight or size much. Another thing that I experienced was plantar fasciitis, which is a condition which affects your feet, and this meant that I had to get orthopedic splints when I was younger. And again, I can look back and understand now that that was likely caused by the loose tendons in my feet causing me pain. And I also had excessive dental crowding. To the point where, because my palate is so narrow, I actually had a second layer of teeth behind my first layer. So I had to have a lot of teeth removed and I had braces for 2.5 years. That was fun. And the final symptom that I struggled with in early childhood manifested about the age of 10 or 11, and this would just be random episodes of fainting. So I remember my parents would find me sometimes on the bathroom floor after having come out of the shower, and I just literally passed out, seemingly for no reason. We did go to the doctors about these symptoms. They tested me for anemia, they ruled out a couple of other things, and we just couldn't find a cause. I can now look back and understand that this was when my first symptoms of POTS were manifesting. So now we're moving on to late childhood / early teenagehood, and this is when I started to experience a lot more symptoms, but I still didn't really have any idea what was wrong with me, which can be a very confusing time. The first of these was fatigue, as I mentioned earlier, and at this point it became particularly severe. I would really struggle throughout the school day, walking to and from school. Just completing normal day-to-day activities would just make me feel absolutely exhausted, and that exhaustion followed me every single day, all day. And this is also when my POTS symptoms became a little bit more noticeable also. So obviously I wasn't diagnosed yet. I can understand looking back now that those were the symptoms I was experiencing. So I would get very breathless, especially if I completed any activity. I'd get headaches, I'd get brain fog, and just generally feel quite spaced out a lot of the time. And this is the first time that I really started to struggle with joint instability also. So this is when I had my first subluxation, and it happened after I'd had a chest infection. So I'd been coughing quite severely, and I popped one of my ribs out and severed the intercostal muscles, which was incredibly painful. Obviously that was quite unusual, but at the time I just thought it might be my strange anatomy. And my pain at this time definitely started to get a lot more severe also. So I was having widespread pain throughout my body, particularly in my joints, and also muscle pain. But I didn't really mention it to anybody or tell anybody about it because I just thought, well, maybe everybody feels this way, or maybe everybody's in pain. So I just pushed on and I just carried on. And at this time, I definitely noticed that there was something going on with my hips also, because I could just pop them out on demand. And to be honest, I used to use it as a bit of a party trick. I thought it was quite entertaining that I could just pop them out very easily, but it is a subluxation, and I have now since subluxed and dislocated my hips, so I'm not going to show that on camera, and I would very much recommend you do not do that if your hips pop out. So something that became extremely noticeable at this time was a combination of my stomach problems and allergies, and this is when I was referred to a gastroenterologist for the first time to try and investigate that. I was having a lot of problems like nausea, vomiting, extreme stomach bloating every single time I would eat, and also severe pain. And this would happen every single time I ate a meal, regardless of what it was. I mentioned before about the milk allergy I had. This now manifested as an allergy to grains, then an allergy to sugar, then an allergy to some fruits, and it just continued and continued throughout this cycle until there was roughly only 5 foods that I would be able to tolerate without having a reaction. And I got diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome and prescribed a diet plan to try, which I tried, but unfortunately it didn't give me much relief from my symptoms. I can look back now and understand that what I was experiencing here for the first time was symptoms of gastroparesis, which I now have a diagnosis of. So if you haven't heard of gastroparesis, it means that you have a partially or entirely paralysed digestive tract. and that can make it extremely difficult to eat, very painful, means that digesting food is extremely slow, and you often experience symptoms such as nausea and vomiting. And other symptoms I was struggling with were headaches and migraines. Just headaches and migraines. And also bladder problems, which I'm not going to touch on too much in this video, and brain fog. And I always absolutely loved school. I was a very academic person, but I do remember that I would have times where I just found it extremely difficult to concentrate. It felt like there was mashed potato in my brain, and I would struggle to find the words for what I wanted to say. Yeah, it was just really tough, and I didn't understand why, but now I can understand that better. And my immune system problems also continued at this time, so I would get sick a lot, and I would get very unusual infections for a young adult. So I got strep throat several times, I had scarlet fever, I got mono, and I would just constantly be sick. So it's very clear that at this time something was going on. I had a lot of different symptoms, but I still had no diagnosis. I had nothing to connect them all together. And I think sometimes there is a misconception that when you get sick, you go to the doctor, you get diagnosed, and then you have treatment and you get better. But in reality, that's often not the journey for most people. And I think especially if you have complex symptoms, you have a wide array of symptoms, if you have a rare or underdiagnosed condition, it can be extremely difficult, and many people have to really fight to get a diagnosis. And it got to the point where I almost didn't believe myself anymore. I just thought, okay, there's a lot of things going on, perhaps these are just quirks that I have. The doctors don't seem too concerned about me, so now we're moving into my early 20s, and this is when I had a huge health crash. It literally felt like my entire body was falling apart. So a lot of these symptoms, despite having obviously quite a complex medical history, came on very suddenly and very severely. So the first thing that I developed was very severe ME. So if you haven't heard of ME, it's also sometimes called chronic fatigue syndrome, and it's a condition which causes debilitating fatigue as the hallmark symptom. So I would literally sleep at this time for about 20 hours per day. And I was also bedbound for about 5 months where I didn't leave my bed at all. And my immune system problems had gotten particularly severe. So I had 3 viral infections active in my system at the same time, which I had to take antiviral drugs for. I then relapsed and I had to take antiviral drugs again just to get those under control. And this is when my mast cell activation syndrome became particularly severe. So I've mentioned previously about having allergies and intolerances and sensitivities. This is when they became so bad to the point where I couldn't eat food without having an allergic reaction or a reaction of some kind. So my reactions were to food, to environmental allergens such as dust or chlorine I'm also allergic to, pharmaceutical drugs, just everything. My body became so unstable, and these reactions would range from having headaches and stomach symptoms to my tongue swelling up, having full anaphylaxis, and my blood pressure dropping to 80/50. And this would happen every single day, multiple times a day. And during this time, I just spent a lot of time in hospital, just trying to figure out what was wrong with me. It's also the time that my POTS became particularly severe. So to give a quantifiable number for you, when I would sit up or stand up, I would experience extreme tachycardia. So for example, if I had a resting heart rate of about 60 BPM, which is very normal for me, very normal in general, I would then sit up and that would race up to 140, 150. If I attempted to stand up, my BP would literally rise up to 220 beats per minute. And it would feel like I'd run a marathon, just standing up. And that comes with horrid symptoms such as dizziness, fainting, which often would happen, headaches, nausea, vomiting, and it was completely debilitating at this time. Even sitting up from a horizontal position was extremely difficult. It just honestly felt like my body was falling apart. And my dislocations and subluxations became a lot more severe also, which I expect is because I wasn't able to exercise or really do much activity to keep my muscles strong. So my shoulders started to come out every single day. I would even wake up sometimes and they would not be in the sockets. My hips, my hands, and even my jaw started to dislocate at this time. So even now it causes me quite a lot of anxiety to yawn. I quite often have to hold my jaw in place because if I don't, it will dislocate. And it's really worth stressing here that I still had no diagnosis. I still didn't know what was wrong with me. I'd been to the GI specialist, I knew there was something going on there. I knew I had POTS, I knew I had immune problems and allergies, but the puzzle pieces still hadn't been put together. And I still had no clue why I was feeling this way. I was so lucky to go and see a wonderful doctor who happened to have Ehlers Danlos syndrome herself. I know. In the appointment, she diagnosed me within 20 minutes, after 21 years of symptoms. And it changed my life. It changed my life entirely. And it felt amazing to finally have a name to what was going on, but it's also extremely confusing and overwhelming and a lot of information to process. And when you get diagnosed, it's often not the end of the battle. Unfortunately, with Ehlers Danlos syndrome, there isn't a cure. I've definitely had some treatments that have made me a lot better and have changed my life, but I do still deal with symptoms on a day-to-day basis. So, moving into the present day and now, I am now at university. I function pretty well on a day-to-day basis, and that's a huge achievement and I'm incredibly proud. I look back and it's crazy to think about a few years ago. I could barely read, I couldn't really stand up, I could barely even sit up without having symptoms. I slept for 20 hours a day, I had moments where I couldn't even understand the world around me, and I really did feel hopeless at that time. So it feels amazing to have been able to progress to this point where I'm able to live life again. So I still have a lot of symptoms, I still have allergies and sensitivities and stomach problems and joint problems and fatigue, but they're a lot more well managed these days. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I feel like I've condensed a lot of information down into 20 minutes. Obviously you can never tell your full health history, especially when it's as complex as this. But I'm going to be making a lot more videos. So if you're somebody who has EDS or thinks you might have EDS, or you have a chronic illness of some kind, or you're just interested to learn, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Be sure to check out my next ones. So if you've been through something similar, I would love to hear from you. And I hope this video will help somebody to feel less alone about what they're going through, and also to raise awareness about a very underdiagnosed condition. Thank you so much for watching. I'm sorry if I've babbled a little bit. I feel like I most definitely have, but hey. This was my story of Ehlers Danlos syndrome and how it's affected me. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you have a very wonderful day, and I will see you in my next video. Take care.